In this lecture, we're going to review the connections within the autonomic nervous system, starting with the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system has neuron extensions through the thoracolumbar spinal cord. So the spinal cord that traverses the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine. And we see that the gray matter of the lateral horn, of the lateral portion of the ventral horn, contains the cell bodies of what we call the preganglionic neurons. Recall that the sympathetic chain refers to a cluster of neuron cell bodies located just outside in close proximity to the spinal cord, and the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system will extend through a short distance into the sympathetic chain, where those neurons will synapse with longer, what are called postganglionic neurons that will merge into the spinal nerve and will synapse onto various effector organs. And we see this throughout the majority of the thoracolumbar spinal cord. There are other extensions of the sympathetic nervous system, however, that do not work through the sympathetic chain. And what we see here is a long neuron of the sympathetic nervous system that synapses directly with the cells, in this example, of the adrenal medulla. Specifically, the connection occurs between this long sympathetic neuron and the individual cell within that central part of the adrenal gland. And that cell is referred to as a chromaffin cell. Another extension of the sympathetic nervous system occurs with a relatively longer preganglionic neuron or fiber that synapses onto a postganglionic fiber. However, the postganglionic cluster is located close to the effector organ, and this is just simply referred to as a collateral ganglion near the effector organs. Speaking to the chromaffin cell of the adrenal medulla, the objective of activating a chromaffin cell will secrete three types of catecholamines, and these are signaling molecules, also referred to as hormones, that will trigger a response in other cells through the body. 80% of the secretions from the chromaffin cells are in the form of epinephrine. 20% are a similar molecule to epinephrine referred to as norepinephrine, and there's a small amount of dopamine that is also secreted by the central part of the adrenal gland. Examining the specific connections in a closer manner here on this slide, here we see once again the sympathetic chain located in close proximity but outside the spinal cord, and of course we have spinal nerves that are collections of neurons, most of which are mixed nerves that contain both sensory and outflowing motor axons as well. We see that the ventral root refers to the portion of the spinal nerve exiting from the ventral side. We have the dorsal root, which is the portion of the spinal nerve that is connected to the dorsal side of the spinal cord, and of course the enlargement of the dorsal root close by the spinal cord that contains the cell bodies of the sensory neurons is the dorsal root ganglion. But if we focus on the neuron of the sympathetic nervous system, or a typical neuron of the sympathetic nervous system, here we see that the neuron will exit the spinal cord through the ventral root and will synapse through what's called the white ramus. White indicating that this portion that enters the sympathetic chain is made up of axons and is considered to contain the terminal parts of the preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system. Within the sympathetic chain, we see that the extension away from the sympathetic chain is what's called the gray ramus. And it's gray because we see a collection of cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons that will then extend out to the effector organs. The extension to the adrenal gland, as we see here, refer to these glands that sit on top of the kidneys, and the central part of the adrenal gland is what is innervated directly from sympathetic neurons. The outer layers of the adrenal gland is referred to as the adrenal cortex and are affected by hormones secreted by the pituitary gland. But coming back to the sympathetic preganglionic neuron, in this case we see a very long neuron exiting the spinal cord, and instead of synapsing through the sympathetic chain, this neuron will extend directly to the inner portion, the inner tissue of the adrenal gland, which is made up of chromaffin cells. And the chromaffin cells will secrete catecholamine type of signaling molecules, also referred to as hormones, and those hormones will move into the cardiovascular system, and the sympathetic preganglionic neuron will release a neurotransmitter that will activate the chromaffin cell to secrete those catecholamines, most of which, about 80%, is in the form of epinephrine. And once epinephrine is produced and secreted and enters the cardiovascular system, epinephrine will travel throughout the body and trigger physiological reactions in a wide range of different cells. Coming to the parasympathetic nervous system, we start with the central nervous system component here, and we see the cell bodies contained within the central nervous system for the parasympathetic branch exist and exit from the brainstem and from the sacral region, as we'll discuss here shortly. But the extensions of the parasympathetic nervous system exists as cranial nerves, and these cranial nerves will send out long axons into the peripheral nervous system as in the form of preganglionic neurons that will synapse with postganglionic neurons, and those postganglionic neurons will then exert some physiological effect on effector organs. The other portion of the parasympathetic nervous system exists on the more inferior part of the spinal cord, and that is the sacral portion of the spinal cord. And we see that the majority of these neurons exit through the pelvic nerve, and the neurons contained within the pelvic nerve are considered preganglionic neurons that will synapse onto postganglionic neurons that will affect the function of various effector organs. So with the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons are contained, or at least the cell bodies are contained, within the brainstem or the sacral spinal cord, and will have long extensions to ganglia. Once again here, when we talk about ganglia, we are referring to clusters of cell bodies. These happen to be located near, in close proximity to the effector organs, and from which exits short postganglionic neurons. And they have shorter axons than the preganglionic neurons, and these are axons that extend from the ganglia to a range of various effector organs. To summarize the nerves of the parasympathetic nervous system, in the superior part of the nervous system, these extensions exist through the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10, cranial nerve 3, which is also referred to as the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve, and the glossopharyngeal nerve, also referred to as cranial nerve 9, as well as various spinal nerves, will carry extensions of the parasympathetic nervous system, and the pelvic nerves are distinctive from somatic spinal nerves, which also exit from the lower region of the spinal cord, and those somatic spinal nerves are those that control the conscious or exert conscious control of skeletal muscle. So this ends this portion of our lecture on the autonomic nervous system.